Israel is often called the Middle East's only democracy, but its democracy seems to be on the brink. 3 months of protests that peaked over the last few days has forced Israel's larger-than-life Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to put on pause a plan to overhaul the way the judiciary works in the country. This breather, though, is a temporary one, and while it has helped in reducing the intensity of protests for now, the problem has not gone away. So what is this judicial overhaul, and why has it got Israelis worried that their democracy may be in danger? Let's first take a look at this report.
A nation up in arms. A bureaucracy on strike. And a prime minister humbled. That's the story of Israel in a nutshell. The story of democracy's triumph over a populist demigod. Dissent was brewing ever since Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu introduced a new judicial reform. It sought to give the parliament sweeping powers over the Supreme Court. The response was swift. Tens of thousands of Israelis hit the streets in protest. They demanded the reform be withdrawn immediately. Sunday was the biggest night of demonstrations. Netanyahu fired his defense minister after he criticized the proposed legislation. Israelis were on the streets with renewed vigor. Riot cops ended up dispersing the crowd with water cannons. But the next day, Israel's largest trade union called for a general strike. It crippled government services across the country. This is Ben Gurion Airport, Israel's largest. Passengers here were in for a rude surprise on Monday. One by one, the flights on the departure board turned red. Thousands of travelers were left stranded as the aviation staff joined the strike. All flights were grounded.
הגענו לפני חצי שעה בערך, גילינו את זה דרך רשתות החדשות, ואנחנו מאוד מבולבלים, רוצים לדעת אם אנחנו נוסעים או לא נוסעים.
Ports too were shut down. Workers at Israel's largest ports, Haifa and Ashdod, joined the general strike. So did food joints, malls and banks. McDonald's, for example, announced that its branches across Israel will remain shut. Put simply, the entire country ground to a halt. It was Israel versus Benjamin Netanyahu. Even outside the country, people boycotted work. Israeli embassies across the world, including here in India, shut down. They halted consular services once the strike call was issued. All of this had the intended effect.
מתוך אחריות לאומית, מתוך הרצון למנוע את הקרע בעם, החלטתי להשהות את הקריאה השנייה והשלישית של החוק במושב הזה של הכנסת, כדי לתת זמן לנסות להגיע לאותה הסכמה רחבה לקראת החקיקה במהלך הכנסת הבאה.
For a right-wing populist/strongman, it was a major humbling. Netanyahu had stormed back to power after multiple coalition governments. He's backed by orthodox Israelis and hardliners. Hundreds of them turned up to organize a counter-protest in Jerusalem. But their voice was drowned by the larger chorus for democracy. Even as Israelis celebrate this victory, there's uncertainty about what the future holds. The Prime Minister may have decided to delay the legislation, but he has not scrapped it. There are lessons here for any democracy willing to learn. Even though Netanyahu is a hardline nationalist leader, people stood up against him. Veterans, former spy chiefs, serving fighter pilots, and soldiers. All of them criticized what they believed was wrong. So did Netanyahu's own allies and cabinet ministers. That's what democracy is all about. And that's the lesson for people who confuse nation first with government first.
To speak more on this, I'm joined now by Professor Ido Baum. He's a law and economics professor and director of the Brandeis Institute for Society, Economy and Democracy in Israel. Lieutenant Colonel Avital Leibovich is also with us, Director, American Jewish Committee. They're both joining us from Tel Aviv on this show. Welcome to both of you, and thank you so much for speaking with us. Professor Ido, let me begin by getting your take on the very fact that Mr. Netanyahu had to backtrack. We heard his address on Monday where he says, let's give some time to have a conversation and a dialogue between both sides. But a day later, we see that both sides are fairly entrenched in their view. One side says this judicial overhaul must not happen, and the other side is insistent on it. So is this 1 month actually going to make a difference?
Will make a difference. This is also a month of holidays here in Israel, and I think given the really strong protests, unexpected protests, I think, of huge crowds that took to the streets against this democratic backslide, at least as the way they see that. I think it was obvious that Netanyahu could not, or Netanyahu's coalition could not just disregard the public reaction. And it was kind of expected, especially after the reaction to the Prime Minister's deciding to sack the Minister of Defense. It was widely accepted that there needs to be some kind of halt to this legislation process. But you were correct in saying that both parties, 24 hours after this halt, both parties seem to be entrenched in their position. So if you'd ask me to forecast where we're going, I think what we will see during the next month is attempts for both parties on the political sides to discuss possible compromises to the judicial overhaul that's being proposed, but it seems, at least from the standpoint of the beginning of these discussions, that a month from now we will be in a very similar place, because both parties are significantly entrenched in their positions, and what we might see in a month from now is that the same legislation is going to be renewed or resumed in more or less the same vein that it's going through at the moment.
So it's essentially a timeout, as it has been described, by Mr. Netanyahu as well. Now, Lieutenant Colonel Leibovich, I want to understand, of course, where do you think this is going, and also why there is so much resistance? What is the fear that people have? What will happen if, for example, one of the issues seems to be the committee that appoints judges will be more government-dominated? What is the concern on how it will impact democracy in Israel?
Thank you. I have to say that I disagree with my distinguished colleague here. On the contrary, because what you mentioned and what he mentioned is, of course, the extent of the demonstrations, which really struck the country by surprise. The amount of people, the fact that people were protesting from the northern part of Israel to the southern part, the fact that people were from every single political faction, religious and secular, newcomers and old-time Israelis, I think it's a clear indication to those sitting and trying to reach a compromise of the price that Israel has if this compromise will not be reached, the price that Israel could pay, the very high price that Israel could pay. So I think this is some sort of a compass for those politicians sitting right now and trying to negotiate. Now, I do make a distinction between the public statements, which are obviously meant for certain ears, the voters of those politicians, and what's going on behind the scenes. And there is a difference between those things. The Israelis now are concerned by the change of the democratic value of the country, because if those judges will be elected based on political affiliation only, this actually takes away one of the most sacred values in Israeli society, really the democratic essence of the society. And this is why people do not agree to such a situation. Plus, it could also be some sort of a preset to other decisions, which will be, again, ground-breaking values in other aspects and regions as well. So this is why Israelis are quite busy going and devoting their Saturday nights to major protests across the country. By the way, this coming Saturday night, there will still be protests.
Yes.
Even though Netanyahu gave the declaration yesterday, and we need to monitor and see whether the total atmosphere in the country will be more calmer than what we have seen in the last 12 weeks.
So the protests continue, but at a lesser intensity after this time has been bought. But I want to come back to the primary issue of why the concern. Because these are issues that seem to echo around the world and are not unusual, I would say, debates, where the powers of the judiciary end versus the power of an elected parliament or an elected set of representatives. We have not the same, but a kind of a debate going on here in India as well, which is why it's interesting to understand how Israelis are looking at it. Professor Ido, for Benjamin Netanyahu, has this also become a political compulsion, considering the kind of government he heads and who his allies are? Does he have the space and scope to step away from his position or to water down his position?
I assume that given the kind of coalition that Benjamin Netanyahu is leading at the moment, he is under severe pressure from his counterparts to pursue at least the essence of these reforms. And I think on the essence of the reforms, we agree, but maybe our outlook seems to be different. One of the things that Netanyahu had to agree to in order to take this time out, and this is something that came out in the last 24 hours, is that the Israeli government will promote a legislation that will give one of Netanyahu's coalition parties, Itamar Ben-Gvir, the Minister for Internal Security, a sort of police force that will be directly under his command. This is unheard of. This is another police force by the government police force, and this is an example of the kind of pressure that Benjamin Netanyahu is under, and this also explains why the wide protests are not ending. I think everyone understands in the public that this is not the end of the story. This is only a time out, and if you look at Israeli democracy, and you mentioned it, Israel has a very thin democracy. Basically, the parliament is controlled by the government, and the only checks and balances on the power of the government in Israel is the Supreme Court. So taking over the judiciary is a matter of a lot of concern. It basically will give the government unfettered power. And actually, over the last week, there were experts from India and Hungary and Poland visiting Israel and assessing the situation and sort of giving us advice and teaching us their own experience. Some experts in my institute, in the Brandeis Institute, were looking at the economic outlook for Israel, and I think Israelis that have 75 years of experience with democracy, and they look at what happens in other countries that are backsliding from democracy, are worried because a significant portion of the Israeli population is unwilling to go in that direction. That's why I think the protests are not waning, and I think the compromise is not something that's easy to reach. It's not impossible, but not easy.
The question really, in that sense, is for how long will it go on? Considering that the next election you have in this country is in 2027, Mr. Netanyahu does have a majority at this point, so we could postpone this entire conflict to a month, which is what he has done, but you have a much longer duration for them to try and push forward this political agenda. So Professor Ido, follow up for you there. What is the way out, or is there going to be maybe 3 or 4 years more of strife?
Oh, no, not 3 or 4 years. This is in Israel, usually governments fall, lose the support of the coalition after a much shorter time. On average, an Israeli government persists for approximately 2 years, and then we go for election. And I think in that sense, if Netanyahu is unable to pass the essence of the reforms that his coalition is expecting, then this coalition might disintegrate. I mean, the mere fact that Netanyahu had to promise this kind of political police force shows you that he's under pressure from his allies in the coalition. So what we are seeing now is a timeout for at least a month, and then Netanyahu promised that the legislation will pass in the next session of the parliament, the summer session. So I think if we are looking at a timeline over the summer, maybe even before the summer, we should know what's coming out of this. And the question is only if the protests and the protesters will actually continue in the same level of intensity that we're seeing over such a period of time. Surprisingly, they've done so for more than 3 months. I think no one in Israel would have imagined that we would be in such a situation. But this is the fact. So I think we will see a solution in a few months' time.
So the question then, and let me bring this to Lieutenant Colonel Leibovich, is what lasts longer, the intent to bring this judicial overhaul or the government that wants to do it? Is that the right way to understand it from my viewer's perspective?
Look, political survival is not something new to politicians. This is obviously a long time and worldwide goal of politicians. So even in this case, of course, it has even additional meaning here because this may very well be Netanyahu's last term as prime minister. And as such, he would definitely want to leave behind him some sort of a legacy. He would want to enter the pages of history. And the question is, how does he plan to do it? Whether he plans to do it through political issues within his own government and political lack of stability, or whether he plans to put the emphasis elsewhere, for example, expanding the Abraham Accords to additional Muslim countries from the region. So basically, he has his hands on the wheel, and he needs to navigate his way with a very, very pressuring and not easy and challenging coalition. 64 seats is stable enough. I mean, we have to look at the numbers, and it is a stable coalition. So there are good chances that this coalition will last its term. However, again, the question of impact is being raised, and we need to see where the emphasis goes. In addition to all of this, there are other regional factors we need to keep in mind. For example, Israel's security. We are in a sensitive security situation in some of our borders, and this could have very well an impact on the stability of the government, on the decisions the government is taking, and of course about the public opinion. And the Israeli people, I think similar to the Indian people, I think that Israeli people are very politically involved. They're political animals. Yes. And you can see that with a high vote of elections, a high percentage vote of people electing their parties and prime minister, which is around 70%. And you can see it in the streets, and you can see it in opinions, in newspapers, in media, in social media. We are very much political animals. So the public opinion here definitely also has a role to play.
Well, I think I would second that. We are very political animals here in India as well. And the stability of Israel's democracy is something that the world is looking at, especially in the Middle East. So I want to thank both of you for joining us today and sort of explaining and taking us through what really the situation is in Israel. Thank you.